Cuba's airports have gone dark. On February 9, 2026, Cuban aviation authorities issued official NOTAMs, or notices to air missions, warning that Jet A1 aviation fuel would not be available for commercial refueling at the island's 9 international airports from February 10th through at least March 11th, according to Flight Radar 24 and AirHelp. According to AirHelp, the affected airports include Jose Marti International in Havana, Varadero, Cienfuegos, Santa Clara, Camagüey, Cayo Coco, Holguin, Santiago de Cuba, and Manzanillo, effectively covering every international gateway to the island. According to Flight Radar 24, the shortages linked to the blockade of Venezuelan oil exports to Cuba and the threat of sanctions on countries supplying fuel to the island, while Aviation Direct attributed it to what it described as an intensified strategy of pressure from the Trump administration on Cuba's energy supply. The response from international carriers was immediate. Air Canada announced on February 10th that it was suspending all flights to Cuba, according to NPR and the Associated Press. The airline said it would dispatch empty southbound aircraft to retrieve roughly 3,000 Canadian travelers stranded on vacation packages across the island. According to AirHelp and Aviation Direct, WestJet suspended all Cuba operations the same day, offering free rebooking through February 26th, and Air Transat canceled every Cuba flight through April 30th. CBS News reported that American Airlines was also canceling services to the island. In total, according to AirHelp, more than 400 scheduled weekly flights to and from Cuba now face cancellations or severe disruptions during what would normally be peak tourist season. The scale of the Canadian withdrawal carries particular economic weight. Canada is not only Cuba's largest source of tourists, but also, according to reporting from the Associated Press and travel industry analysts, the island's second largest source of direct foreign investment, particularly in mining and tourism sectors that were already struggling to recover from pandemic-era losses. The suspension of Canadian carriers removes a significant portion of Cuba's remaining inbound capacity at a time when hotel occupancy had already fallen below 25%, according to official Cuban statistics reported by Cuba Headlines. Russian carriers moved to repatriate their citizens. According to Fox News and Reuters, citing Russia's federal air transport agency Rossiya, airlines Rossiya and Nordwind were forced to adjust their flight programs due to problems securing fuel in Cuba. Rossiya said Rossiya had changed its schedule specifically to ensure the evacuation of Russian tourists currently on the island. According to Xinhua, which cited Aeroflot's own Telegram channel, Rossiya announced at least 6 one-way return flights from Cuban airports to Moscow, with all subsequent flights on those routes to be canceled from February 24th. Nordwind said it would operate repatriation flights only from the resort locations of Varadero, Holguin, and Cayo Coco. Tour operators estimated that at least 4,000 Russians remained on the island when the suspensions took effect, according to Media and Yahoo News. Moscow's response extended well beyond evacuation logistics. According to Al Jazeera, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on February 10th that Moscow was discussing possible solutions to provide Havana with whatever assistance it needs. Russia's embassy in Havana told the Russian media outlet Izvestia that Moscow plans to send humanitarian aid shipments of oil and petroleum products, though no timeline was specified. Moscow has accused Washington of attempting to suffocate the Caribbean island nation. Russia's Ministry of Economic Development advised citizens to refrain from traveling to Cuba until the situation normalizes, and tour operators were instructed to stop selling Cuba packages entirely, according to Media. More than 130,000 Russians visited Cuba in 2025, making them the third largest group of visitors after Canadians and Cubans living abroad. The airline suspensions underscore the depth of the Russia-Cuba relationship, which has expanded significantly in recent years. According to Yahoo News, Russia, isolated by international sanctions over its war in Ukraine, has sought to expand economic and trade ties with Cuba, encouraging Russian companies in banking, agriculture, and technology to begin operations on the island. Rossiya said Moscow and Havana were exploring alternative solutions to resume air traffic in both directions, and that the agency was closely monitoring the situation alongside Russia's Ministry of Transport, according to Reuters. The crisis traces directly to Executive Order 14,380, signed by President Trump on January 29th. According to the White House fact sheet, the order declared a national emergency with respect to Cuba and established a framework to impose additional ad valorem tariffs on goods imported into the United States from any country that directly or indirectly provides oil to Cuba. The mechanism operates like secondary sanctions using tariffs, targeting not Cuba itself, but third countries to change their behavior, according to analysis from Mayor Brown and Clark Hill. The order, effective January 30, does not impose specific tariff rates immediately, but authorizes the Secretary of State and Secretary of Commerce to identify covered countries and recommend rates for presidential action. The White House fact sheet described the Cuban government as aligning itself with and providing support for hostile countries and groups including Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah, framing the measures as part of a broader strategy to counter what the administration characterized as Cuba's malign influence in the Western Hemisphere. According to Greenberg-Traurig, the order invokes the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the same legal authority the administration has used to impose tariffs in other trade disputes now being challenged before the Supreme Court. The executive order compounded an already dire supply situation. Venezuela had been Cuba's primary crude oil supplier, providing around 75% of the island's imported oil in recent years, according to reporting cited by EFE. Those shipments were cut off after American forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on January 3rd, according to multiple outlets including NBC News and the Associated Press. With Venezuelan crude no longer flowing, Cuba turned to Mexico, which through its state oil company Pemex had been shipping nearly 20,000 barrels per day through September 2025, according to Pemex's own report cited by NBC News. After U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio visited Mexico City, that figure dropped to approximately 7,000 barrels, according to satellite tracking by Jorge Piñon at the University of Texas Energy Institute. The combined loss of Venezuelan and Mexican supply has left Cuba without its two most reliable petroleum sources. According to Anadolu Agency, since the Trump administration's January 3rd military operation to capture Maduro, Washington has sought to strengthen its pressure on Cuba as part of a broader campaign against what it describes as hostile governments in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico's position grew increasingly difficult. According to NBC News, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said on January 28th that Pemex had at least temporarily paused some oil shipments to Cuba. Sheinbaum described the decision as a sovereign one and denied it was made under pressure from Washington, according to the Associated Press. The Financial Times identified Mexico, Venezuela, Russia, and Algeria as the leading exporters of oil to Cuba in recent years, with Mexico becoming the primary supplier after Venezuelan exports declined. The executive order's broad language, targeting any country that directly or indirectly sells or provides oil, placed Mexico's trade relationship with the United States under scrutiny, particularly given the upcoming 2026 review of the USMCA trade agreement, as noted by Mayor Brown. The consequences on the ground have been severe and far-reaching. According to Euronews and CBS News, fuel rationing now extends well beyond aviation. Gas stations sell fuel only in U.S. dollars and limit purchases to 20 liters per customer. State enterprises have shortened their work weeks. School hours have been reduced. Bank operating hours have been cut. Cuba's public bus system in Havana has effectively ground to a halt, leaving residents stranded. Cultural events, including the Havana International Book Fair, have been suspended. The national baseball season has been restructured for greater efficiency. Power outages lasting up to 10 hours have become routine, and according to CBS News, many Cubans compare current conditions to the special period of the 1990s, the severe economic depression that followed the collapse of Soviet aid. The comparison is not made lightly. The special period saw Cuba's GDP contract by roughly 35% after Moscow withdrew subsidies, and the current crisis carries echoes of that era in its combination of fuel scarcity, food insecurity, and transportation paralysis. According to the Associated Press, even before the latest fuel emergency, Cuba was already experiencing its worst economic crisis in decades, with GDP contracting by 1.1% in 2024 and U.S. sanctions costing the island nearly $8 billion in lost revenue from March 2024 to February 2025 alone. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel has framed the crisis in stark terms. In remarks carried by Cuban state media, Diaz-Canel branded the American measures an energy blockade and described what he called economic strangulation designed to cut Cuba off from critical fuel resources. He asked how the country would keep children's classes running, how the medical system would function, how food would be distributed, and how farmers would till the land without fuel. Diaz-Canel acknowledged that the measures would demand sacrifice, but said the option of surrender is not an option for Cuba, adding that the country has always had to function amidst adversities and pressures not imposed on anyone else in the world. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez condemned the executive order as a brutal act of aggression against Cuba and its people, according to the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. Rodriguez accused Washington of resorting to blackmail and coercion to force other countries to join its blockade policy. Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos de Casio wrote on social media that the United States was tightening its embargo after what he called the failure of decades of relentless economic warfare. At the same time, Diaz-Canel signaled willingness to engage in dialogue with the United States, but insisted on conditions of equality, sovereignty, and mutual respect, and without preconditions. As international carriers retreated, Mexico stepped forward. According to the Associated Press, 2 Mexican Navy ships, the Papaloapan and the Isla Holbox, docked in Havana on February 12th, carrying a combined total of more than 800 tons of humanitarian aid. One ship delivered approximately 536 tons of food, including rice, beans, milk, sardines, meat products, cookies, canned tuna, and vegetable oil, along with personal hygiene items. The second carried over 277 tons of powdered milk. The ships had departed from the Mexican port of Veracruz earlier that week, according to the Associated Press. Yohandri Espinosa, a 34-year-old engineer who watched the Papaloapan arrive with his daughter, told the Associated Press that the aid was incredibly important for the Cuban people at this moment, adding that they are living through difficult times of great need and uncertainty and do not know how long it will last. Mexican President Sheinbaum said on February 12th that as soon as the ships return, Mexico would send more support of different kinds. Her administration confirmed plans to dispatch an additional 1,500 tons of beans and powdered milk, according to the Associated Press. Sheinbaum has positioned Mexico as a potential mediator, telling reporters that Mexico is doing everything on its part to generate a dialogue that allows Cuba, within the framework of its sovereignty, to receive oil and its essential derivatives for daily functioning. She called the sanctions against Cuba unjust, saying that while one may disagree with the Cuban government, sanctions should never affect the people, according to NPR. China also entered the diplomatic arena. According to Reuters, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian told reporters on February 10th that Beijing firmly supports Cuba in safeguarding its national sovereignty and security and opposes foreign interference. Lin added that China would always provide support and help to the Cuban side to the best of its abilities, though he declined to specify what form that assistance would take. According to Latin Times, citing EFE, Chinese President Xi Jinping approved emergency assistance that includes $80 million in financial aid and a donation of 60,000 tons of rice. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with his Cuban counterpart Bruno Rodriguez in Beijing on February 5th, according to TRT World, reinforcing what both sides described as strategic partnership in the face of external pressure. According to the South China Morning Post, when pressed on specific measures, Lin declined to confirm any concrete program, saying the next moves would depend on bilateral consultations with Havana. The phrasing suggested conditional backing, likely calibrated to avoid escalating tensions with Washington on other trade and geopolitical fronts, according to analysis from CyberCuba. Nevertheless, the combination of financial aid, food donations, and high-level diplomatic engagement signaled that Beijing intended to position itself as a visible counterweight to American pressure on the island. The United Nations added its voice to growing international concern. According to Latin Times, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he was extremely concerned about the humanitarian situation in Cuba and warned that conditions would worsen, if not collapse, if its oil needs go unmet. Guterres urged all parties to pursue dialogue and respect for international law. According to UN officials cited by Latin Times, Cuba may have only weeks of oil supply remaining at current consumption levels, lending urgency to both the diplomatic track and the humanitarian response already underway. Cuba depends heavily on imported fuel for power generation, transportation, and food distribution, according to TRT World, making even temporary supply disruptions capable of cascading across every sector of the economy and daily life. The fuel crisis strikes at the most vulnerable point of Cuba's economy. Tourism, which once generated up to $3 billion annually, according to the Associated Press, has been in structural decline for years. According to UPI, citing official figures from Cuba's National Office of Statistics, international tourist arrivals dropped to approximately 1.8 million in 2025, down nearly 18% from 2024 and well below the government's target of 2.6 million. The Associated Press reported that arrivals reached 4.8 million in 2018, suggesting the island has experienced a decline of more than 60% in visitor numbers over 7 years, though analysts attribute this to a combination of factors including the pandemic, deteriorating infrastructure, and sanctions. Canada, traditionally Cuba's largest market, saw arrivals decline by more than 12% in 2025, while Russian tourism dropped approximately 29%, according to UPI. According to the Associated Press, tourism once generated up to $3 billion a year and sustained hundreds of small businesses, including hostels and restaurants that opened during the industry's peak years. In Havana, the contrast is visible. The AP reported that the seawall, once packed with tourists, is now dotted mostly with Cuban couples or fishermen, while nearby seaside restaurants sit empty with tablecloths fluttering in the wind as employees clutch menus and scan the horizon for customers that never arrive. Some European carriers have attempted to maintain limited service through costly workarounds. According to Aviation Direct, airlines like Iberia and Air Europa are conducting technical refueling stops in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic before continuing to Havana, since no kerosene is available in Cuba for return flights. Air France has adopted similar alternative routing. Only Aeromexico is reportedly operating without significant changes, as the short distance between Mexico and Cuba allows aircraft to carry sufficient fuel for both legs of the journey, a procedure known in aviation as tankering. For long-haul carriers flying from Europe or North America, however, tankering is technically not feasible because the aircraft cannot carry enough additional fuel for a transatlantic return crossing, according to Aviation Direct. However, according to Aviation Direct, many airline safety departments consider the risk of an aircraft being stranded in Cuba without fuel too high, and further service reductions are expected if the shortage extends beyond March 11th. The crisis has prompted official travel warnings from multiple governments. According to Aviation Direct, the German Foreign Office is now advising against all non-essential travel to Cuba, citing both the uncertainty surrounding air travel and what it described as the looming collapse of the general energy supply. Cubana de Aviación, the national carrier, suspended all flights from Frankfurt until at least early March. Air Canada extended its suspension through at least May 2026, according to Aviation Direct. The combination of canceled flights, fuel rationing, and deteriorating conditions threatens to accelerate Cuba's isolation at precisely the moment when tourism revenue is most desperately needed. According to Aviation Direct, the crisis is also hitting the German travel market, with major tour operator Der Tour offering customers free rebooking to alternative destinations for the entire summer season and free cancellations for all departures through the end of March. The domino effect of airline withdrawals, government travel warnings, and tour operator pullbacks creates a compounding problem where each cancellation reduces the revenue Cuba needs to purchase the very fuel that would restore air service. The fuel crisis represents the convergence of decades of American sanctions, the loss of Venezuela's oil lifeline, Mexico's retreat under tariff pressure, and Cuba's own structural inability to modernize its energy infrastructure. According to Aviation Direct, the island possesses domestic crude oil reserves, but these are heavy and high in sulfur, making processing in existing refineries difficult, and Cuba lacks access to global financial markets needed to upgrade its facilities. In the past, according to Aviation Direct, Cuba compensated for these shortcomings through advantageous agreements with countries like Venezuela, but those sources have dried up. The country's centralized economic model and decades of restricted access to international credit have prevented the kind of infrastructure modernization that might have provided a buffer against exactly this type of supply shock. With the NOTAM currently set to expire on March 11th but subject to extension, and with the United Nations warning that the island may have only weeks of oil remaining, Cuba faces the prospect of prolonged economic and humanitarian strain that extends far beyond grounded aircraft and empty runways.